I'm just going to summarize and maybe just highlight a couple of those issues. I'm Dr. West Paul. I have a background, actually we tried to get a representative from the pharmaceutical industry here, but could not get any takers, and I guess I'm the best one. The first 4 years of my career was in the pharmaceutical industry in drug development. I'm currently in patient safety and quality now, so I have some representation there, and I'd just like to maybe summarize that, because I know when I deal with patients, and I'm still a practicing physician, most of my patients, and we're going to talk about the impact of this not only on healthcare providers but on patients, but most of my patients want to know one thing: who is to blame for this mess? That's constantly the question I get. And you know, I often tell them that there's really no one to blame, but the caveat I point out is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Because most of these things that we were looking at in the presentation were really good intentions. And I'll highlight two, and one I think was touched on, the just-in-time. We call it the businessification of the drug industry, where really in the past 3 or 4 decades, we really have moved to more of the Walmart mentality. The just-in-time, the cost-cutting, the very slim margins of profit that's had. So most industry is keeping very, very small supplies on hand for emergency purposes, such as shutdowns. In the past, where the margins were higher, they were able to keep larger stockpiles. So in reality, as our government and as our industry has tried to force more competition for the better, driving down prices, we have dropped down in the amount we have available in cases where there are issues of production. The second one I think is an interesting caveat of the FDA, because I think they are much vilified and should not be in a lot of these cases. And I think one of the ones, if you're practicing physicians here, may know or may not know the story of colchicine or Colchris. Colchicine is a medication that was never FDA approved for any indication. It was anecdotally used for years to treat gout, and I say anecdotally, but probably pretty good anecdotes. It was known quite well to treat gout and quite effectively. And we had very good safety information on it, but through the FDA, and very rightly so, looking for good evidence-based medicine on all of their medications, said, listen, if we can really show controlled trials that show this, all the better. Well, one smart company said, we'll do it. We'll market our own formulation. We'll go through the money, the effort, the time, and prove that colchicine truly works. Well, they did it, and FDA approved it, and then they enforced their patent. So all the generic houses that made colchicine had to remove it from their formulary. So immediately the price went through the roof. It went from pennies a pill to $10 a pill. And that's one of the first times I had my patients start complaining to me about this. And in reality, the FDA did this really from a scientific bent. I need evidence to prove it, not realizing the ramifications of some of what they do. Now, some of that has actually been remedied. But again, when your patients come to you and go, who is to blame for this? It really is no one, and it really is everyone. But what we have to do is fix it and really realize the ramifications and really who it affects, which is our patients. So we're gonna show a video now, and I think this kind of calls the point home about our patient. And if we could go ahead and play that, then we're gonna have a bit of a panel discussion on this, and we'll go from there. So if we could bring that up.
Personal story about how a drug shortage
Might want to stop
you.
it.
Sure. My name's Chris Harrison. I am 34 years old. Back in 2000, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and had some pretty severe issues with it there at the beginning, and ended up getting on a routine with 2 different drugs that ended up working for me. One is Remicade, and then the other one is methotrexate. The methotrexate I'm taking currently and started taking back in, I guess, probably 2000, 2001, was the injectable version. We tried the oral pills, and those didn't seem to work for me, but the shots really made the big difference for me, I believe. That and the Remicade together. So it was fine up until, it was this time last year, back in January 2012, February 2012 timeframe. My wife and I were actually watching the news in December of 2011 and happened to see that there was some shortages on methotrexate And oddly enough, because it was a drug that drug companies weren't making much money on at the time and just stopped making for some reason, or for that reason. So we didn't think much about it because I had some and figured it'd be a short-term thing. So in January of 2012 is about the time frame I started running low, and I went to get a prescription filled, and the pharmacies couldn't get it. And I ended up calling my doctor at the time and saying, "Hey, is there any line that you have on the drug?" And they weren't able to get it either. So February rolls around, and I ran out of the drug. So about 3 or 4 weeks into not taking the medication is when I really started to feel the effects. Started having weight loss, having all my issues again, and got to the point where I really couldn't go to work just because I was, basically incapacitated.
How much weight did you lose?
Probably in about 2 weeks, I lost 20 to 25 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah, which I could stand to lose, but not that way. So anyhow, I started calling the doc again and saying, "Hey, we got to figure something out. I can't function." He ended up putting me on prednisone, and in the meantime, my granddad's a retired physician. He's calling all the people he knows. My uncles have a lot of connections, and they're calling all their friends, trying to find any place they could get methotrexate.
I'd like to introduce our panel now with regard to the impacts and have them give a bit of their stories at their institutions on how this has really impacted not only from providers but institutions, but also from the patient aspect. And I think the video really frames this very well. And let me introduce our panelists here. First beside me is Dr. Joseph McQuaid. He's Director of Public Health at the Naval Hospital, a long history at the Naval Hospital from what I'm seeing. Family medicine physician, and now Associate Program Director and Acting Residency Director of the Family Medicine Department. Down at the end, Dr. Susan Mims from Missions Children's Hospital, in charge to meet the healthcare needs of children in Western North Carolina. Also, one of my former colleagues, Deborah Harrison. You may see the resemblance of the person in the video, and I'll let her talk to that. She is Chief Nursing Officer at Mayo Clinic in Florida, and Dr. Kelly Kirkpatrick. And I have to say, she says she's from the University of North Carolina. Well, I went to Duke, so I'm going to say go Duke. But she's at Mission Health Hospitals also, and a PharmD there. So I want to introduce the panel, and again, with both of us, I'd like to maybe briefly hear from each about the impact and the issues at their institutions, and then we'll open it up for some questions, and then we're going to have some time to talk about possible solutions to this. So why don't we start with Dr. McQuaid?
Yeah, my job now at the Navy Hospital is the Director of Public Health. And this spring, when we started facing some shortages of rabies vaccine, as well isoniazid, which is a treatment for tuberculosis. Both disorders are not good ones to have. And in recent press in the military, we've had active duty members returning from Afghanistan with contact with a rabid animal in Afghanistan who came back here and actually died of rabies. So rabies is a very frightening one, and it brought to, I kind of sat down with my staff and thought about how should we deal with this at the hospital. Emphasized the need for better communications. Communications from Bureau of Medicine, from the Centers for Disease Control, from the FDA to me, and better communication from me to the immunization staff, to the providers who are using the medications, to the pharmacy. I had to go back behind the pharmacy doors and sit down with the people who actually keep track of how much medication is on the shelves. Now, the Naval Hospital Jacksonville has 5 branch clinics. So we stretch from Key West all the way up to Albany, Georgia, Kings Bay, Mayport. So I had to know that if a child was bit by a dog or had contact with a raccoon or a bat flew into the home and was asleep in a room with a bat and not sure if it had contact, even if it happened in Key West, Florida, I had to know the next day if a vaccine was administered. So it set up a problem for me, because you could talk all you want to say all contacts, any use of this vaccination needs to be cleared with us, but do providers actually comply? And of course we don't. So we set up a patient registry within our electronic health record and got smart. So now anytime the CPT code is loaded for rabies vaccination, I know about it the next morning. So I'm able to go quickly into the electronic health record, look up the patient encounter, and see why was the vaccine given, and then enlist the preventive medicine technicians to ensure that the complete series was given. Because now we have people who are getting the shots and they only come in for 1 or 2 shots and not get the whole deal. So it really made me do my job, essentially. With respect to latent TB, the same thing. So patients are now get a positive PPD and they get started on the medications, they don't refill the medication. So I need to be able to know precisely how much of the drug is being moved off the shelves and is it being given in the correct manner. Highlighted the need for a pharmacy and therapeutics committee to really have some teeth. So now when I sit in the P&T meetings, I don't just sit there and say this is an interesting committee to belong to. No, I say, look, we need to look closer at the use of this. I need your authorization from P&T committee to make a decision about how firmly do we need to clamp down on use of isoniazid. Let's look at what the CDC guidelines are. Let's look at what other Navy hospitals have done in order to help control the use of the medication. And you have to think out of the box too and anticipate urgencies. What if a family had just moved into an apartment and there was a bat flying around and they had a small child that slept in a room they didn't know? And what if the whole family had to be treated? How much vaccine do we have to have ready on hand to be able to administer so we don't have any predictable surprises of, oh, now you're out of the vaccine and you're in trouble? So it has definitely impacted the ability to safely care for our patients, and it has definitely impacted the ability to be ready in event of a real problem.
Hi, I'm Deb Harrison. If there was a resemblance to the patient, it's only accidental. He's my stepson, but his father's in the back, and he lives in Virginia. Well, what part of his story too, just to let you know, when he talked about the cost a little bit, the methotrexate he was able to find in Texas at a pharmacy, but it was a hospital-sized vial that they said he had to pay for to overnight ship to get him there, and it was actually a 2-year supply for him, so he was happy to do that and get it, and it cost a total of $150 for that vial. The insurance company wouldn't pay for it though because it was over the amount that he was supposed to get reimbursed for in the usual every month refills. But it was a small amount. Now the other medication, Remicade, which he gets every 6 to 8 weeks, costs $11,000 a dose. There's never been a shortage of that. So it is why you get a little suspicious of that ramification. From a nurse standpoint, I am the CNO at Mayo, and I worry about this on a frequent basis because I get the flyers that say we're short of this, we're short of that. And I think that we've escaped any serious patient events and injuries, but that's only because we put a lot of effort into, both from the pharmacy and the nursing standpoint, to prevent that from happening. So we look at, there's a lot of substitutions that end up happening that look very similar but are not. I can tell you one of the drugs that the CRNAs talk about that is short periodically is the vasopressin. And that one, if you look at the pharmacy bulletin, I just have to read this to you. It says the safety warning says to avoid dosing errors, be aware that vasopressin is dosed in units and desmopressin is dosed in micrograms. But the alternative agent for a shortage of vasopressin is desmopressin. So you're doing it 2 different things, and then it says there are 2 different indications and actions, but here's your replacement. So it's very difficult to try to figure out what dosage are you giving and are you sure you're giving the right one. We've had issues, we're developing protocols in the cardiac testing areas because there's frequent shortages of atropine and aminophylline. Those 2 come up, and those are those drugs that Bernadette talked about, the IV drugs that are common that now we're wondering, we need to save those for code situations, so should we be trying to find replacements? There isn't a lot of replacements for atropine and things that we can do in those situations, so that's difficult. We've had patients that have shown up at our ambulatory infusion center, and then they get ready to hang that IV, they get the IV started, and they say, oh, we forgot to check, that one is out of stock. We're going to have you come back tomorrow, we'll find another replacement for you. So it's a lot of it is patient inconvenience and problems with that, but very scary near misses that happen because of those look-alike drugs and substitutions.
And I'll echo real quick what both Dr. McQuaid and Deb Harrison said. I was chair of P&T at Mayo for 10 years, I think. That proactive P&T committee, and it wasn't me, it was our pharmacist, of getting ahead of the game, identifying substitutes, talking about what those substitutes mean in dosing is really, I think, one of the key issues. And you're right, a lot of P&T, particularly from a physician standpoint, P&T committees were, boy, that was interesting.
Yeah.
Not a, boy, let's go ahead and do something before it happens and I get caught on the carpet for it, so.
Right.
I think the biggest impact that we've seen just from an overall perspective is the drug shortages making an already very complex medication process into a more complex, unsafe process. So that combined with the amount of time that takes away from care providers what they're supposed to be doing, and making sure that that complex system where medications are short, you're having to make quick changes in a very complex system, and decreasing the risk of medication error, that takes time, that takes energy, and it takes a lot of research. And all of that time is diverted away from their primary responsibility. And so I think the biggest thing that we've realized is the importance of communication of the issues, what drugs are affected, what the alternatives are, and really having a proactive approach to identifying what those alternatives are.
I'll actually echo what Kelly just said. I was just thinking a lot of the discussion this morning, whether it has been around communicating with families or, responding to a drug shortage, is how do we move from being reactive to being proactive? And that has, been one of our major challenges at Mission in dealing with the drug shortages. And in just a few minutes, we're going to tell you a story about a time when we were caught off guard and that we really had to evaluate what happened at that time when we were caught off guard, figure out what to do, what we could learn from it, and set ourselves up in the future so that we would be better able to respond and not be caught off guard. So.
Just one other shortage that I want to share with all of you, and I'm sure many of you have experienced it, is sodium bicarb. It recently just came back, but we struggled with it for many, many months. And so what we did from our pharmacy and therapeutics standpoint, our chairman's actually sitting in the back, Dr. Foster, we got a group of physicians together and we decided there were going to be some limitations on where we were going to use the drug. We found 5 specific indications and limited it to only those 5, and then reserved the others for our crash cart. The other piece that actually helped us and was very successful is using technology. And so we recently implemented electronic health record, Epic, and so when physicians go to order the medication, there's a notice that comes up and says, wait a minute, this is short, we're limiting it to only these 5 indications, and if you need it, you need to call the pharmacy. And so we've come up with these stopgaps to try and preserve our medications, especially the critical ones.
And I'll actually tag on to all of that. I'm at a new institution now, and we were talking about one of our shortages, and for gosh sakes, I cannot remember which one it was. And our chair of pharmacy was speaking and had gone over the substitution protocols, and one of the physicians stood up and said, no one ever told me about this. That ended up being a larger issue that tended to snowball over the next couple of weeks, and the reason they were never told about that was because in the past, when they had been informed of other issues with regard to pharmaceuticals, they told pharmacy in no uncertain circumstances, don't bother us. Communication is absolutely key here. And that was something that I think both sides of the fence kind of finally understood, because the providers were having to explain to the patients, the pharmacists were having to explain to the providers. it was really a situation that was tense that shouldn't have been. And the communication aspect of dealing with this really came to a head very, very quickly on how siloed we are in, or really are within even our hospital situations when we really should be talking a lot to each other. And it was just a great, and now a teaching point for a lot of the institution that we are too siloed, but this really brought it to a head very, very quickly.
The idea of using a huddle or a team steps type approach, the branch clinic up in Kings Bay, Georgia, kept using rabies vaccine, and it was driving me crazy. So I was trying to figure out, why do you keep using this vaccine? I told you we're running out of it. You should not be using it for pre-exposure prophylaxis. We don't have enough to go around. Then I looked closer, and I called the provider on the phone, and we started talking. And it turns out there are people that work up there that I didn't know who require getting the pre-exposure prophylaxis in order to be certified to be able to handle the wildlife or to work with the raccoons up in the bays. And it was mandatory. They had to get the vaccination. So I said, okay, we'll reconsider. We went back to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist looked hard, and she came back and said, well, you know, this drug company is actually selling it, and it can be used for pre-exposure prophylaxis, and we'll be able to do it in this manner. So we're able to flex and get the supply around to get these people certified who absolutely needed it. But it wasn't until we got on the phone and had a nice quiet conversation until I realized he's not trying to bust my chops by ordering all my vaccine. He's just trying to do his job, and I have to try to meet him, and the communication is what's important. And it really shows you how difficult it is to communicate with a large group, a diverse group of providers who are all doing different tasks that we may not be as familiar with as we think.
It's actually unfortunate it takes a shortage for us to realize how siloed and how poor our communication is, even within our own institutions. I know we talk about communication in healthcare, and a lot of people just think of it between provider and patients, but we need to work on our inter-institutional communications probably just as much as we work through this. Any other comments from the panelists? If not, I'd like to open up to any questions or thoughts, realizing we're going to have a presentation about hopefully some best practices and how to do this, but are there any, and again, comments or stories about what you're dealing with now? Is there anyone that has questions? Yeah, Paul.
As a pediatric oncologist, methotrexate is a huge big deal. It is the absolute frontline drug for osteosarcoma and one of the frontline drugs for leukemia. We have to meet every Monday morning. Our pharmacist meets with all of us and tells us what drugs are shortage. And we have not had a week for more than a year where we haven't had that conversation. So without method, we've had to change protocols. It's had to happen at the national level. It's a mess. I think the drug companies also have a real role and responsibility in this. So that, yes, I understand why the FDA caused some problems, but if you see a picture as you showed, they'd be totally remiss not to stop it.
That's right.
And somebody was making a lot of money off of that. And part of it is true game playing. You know, we know that procarbazine, which has been around as a chemotherapy drug for maybe 35 years, was bought out by another company about 5 years ago, and they raised the price 1,500%. There's no R&D in that. That's just rip-off.
I'd like to echo that, because the big elephant in the room with this whole thing is supply and demand. It's economics driven. So I think that I wish there were still some legislators in the room hearing this frustration, because we need to get some government involvement to kind of to regulate this more than it has been, because it's these private companies and it's supply and demand. It comes down to economics, in my mind. The other thing, as far as just from my own personal instance, there absolutely has to be better communication at every level, not just, I mean, our institution develops we have the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee that actually puts out a regular newsletter, but some people don't read that. They put out an email, but some people don't check their email. So you have to actually check at every single level and keep reiterating that communication, because I was the last one to know as the ENT surgical airway expert that there was a national shortage of succinylcholine. That's kind of scary.
I'll just make a comment about, and again, I have no connections with the pharmaceutical industry, but it is interesting. You can take this on a very similar vein to what happened with vaccines in the early 80s. As you may know, vaccines are very costly to produce, very costly to develop, and the litigious atmosphere around vaccines is huge. We were having shortages of almost all vaccines in the early 1980s. It took government to step in and subsidize the vaccine makers to make sure there were no shortages. It will take government action to do the same thing here. Fortunately or unfortunately, our pharmaceutical industry is that. It is a business. They are there for profit margins. Again, our government is there to regulate or to prevent gouging and to make sure there's no shortages. But as of yet, we do not have a lot of government input into a lot of these shortages other than, and I hate to say throwing up their hands, it is going to take, and we don't have a legislative representative here, it is going to take legislative intervention to get some of these kind of off the current issues. So, other thoughts, questions, anecdotes?
Just a comment too on related to that, with the new genetic testing and individualized medicine, we're looking a lot at what doesn't work for this person. If you change the drug a little bit, it works for this. So even though there might be multiple choices, they need multiple choices because as you might have heard Chris say, the oral dose of methotrexate didn't work, the IV did work. So it's that individual to the patient. So having a drug company just decide to discontinue a drug could impact a number of people and where they can't find a good substitution. So we do have to educate. I think, you would think the pharmaceutical companies would know that, right? But our legislatures as well. There are some orphan drug policies and things like that out there that require people to make some for the small use things. So I think they need to keep looking at those legislative issues.
And actually, the orphan drug policies, you're right, but it's not they make them, there's financial incentives to produce orphan drugs. So again, we are a profit-driven industry in the pharmaceutical house, but there, again, I think this has gotten ahead of most legislatures.
We haven't mentioned Decadron, and there was also a Decadron shortage for over a year, which is a drug that's used across all specialties. And my comment really has to do with empowering patients. We talk a lot in the healthcare community about what we can do as providers, what we can do to impact legislation, how we can communicate better with one another across disciplines. But if we were to tell our individual patient who votes and has a voice and can speak to their legislator, I was one of the people that used to lobby once upon a time, that in actuality this is a medication that not only you need, but your child needs, your grandfather needs, that people coming through the emergency room will need, that people involved in motor vehicle collisions and have airway issues will need. When you're on the operating room table, you need it there. If you start to give them information that they can understand and words that they understand, we don't need to do as much of the fighting. We can do a lot more of the patient care and allow them to have the voice and to change the perception that the doctors are the reasons that we're, not able to get the care that we need. We're actually your advocates to give you the information so that you can fight for the care, and then we'll provide it for you.
I think that's a very good point. There was a national survey done in the middle of last year, and they asked patients who they blamed, and again, I said most of my patients said who was to blame for this, who they blamed for pharmaceutical shortage. For the most part, it was the pharmaceutical houses, but number 2 on the list were physicians. So it's, it's kind of damning that we don't educate as well as treat.
Yeah, and along that line, and tying in with some ideas from this morning, to take a more proactive position, I sat down with our chairman of our P&T committee just this week, and we sketched out a plan to build an antibiotic stewardship program at the hospital, because right now there is no gross shortage of Zithromax, God forbid, but if there was, the number of prescriptions that we're generating on a monthly basis is really, frankly, ridiculous. We prescribe so much Zithromax, and you have to stop and say you're overusing it. But what if there was a shortage a year or two down the road of an antibiotic, which we commonly use? Then what are we going to do? Look at the patient and say, "I'm sorry, I can't treat your infection." So we're trying to curb or help control the prescribing patterns of our providers to be more responsible in use of particularly antibiotics such as Zithromax, levofloxacin, Augmentin, amoxicillin, and not prescribe them for things such as chronic bronchitis and sinusitis, and be more discerning in making diagnosis of pneumonia for our patients. So the proactive approach is look ahead to see what are the things that you're really relying on, and what if that was gone in the next year or two, then what would you do?
I'll dovetail on that. I'll ask the panelists as well as the group, and a question that's come up quite a bit: should we stockpile? Should, as institutions that can identify an oncoming threat of shortage, should we stockpile? So
I'll speak to that real quick. We try our very best to look at an average utilization for our patients, because I do think that it is incumbent upon all of us to realize that our patients in our hospitals are not the only ones in hospitals across the United States that need this medication. And so we have to be responsible with how we are contributing to the shortages. And I think stockpiling is not something that we should do. It's we have to be reasonable with what we purchase and what we can provide to our patients. And then we have to be very vigilant about identifying alternatives that provide the same level of care and using those where possible, so that we're leaving supplies to be distributed for patients that are elsewhere.
we had a question in the back there. I don't know if we-
that perhaps the parenterals are much more difficult to produce, that the QC and QA by the FDA is much more stringent, and that could be why some of those shortages occur.
Yes, I think those are all good points. I mean, I think the sterile medication industry, they have many more regulations, many more requirements, and as Bernadette alluded to in her presentation, really the market's ability to reward and identify quality in the generic injectable market is not existent. And so their main competitive edge is better pricing. And that incentivizes them to cut corners that they may not should take. And I think that that's something that we have to look at as a society. How can we build quality back into these sterile injectable medications?
And I think one of the things that we haven't discussed yet are alternative suppliers. And so I know in our institution, we find that we can't get a critical drug, for example, sodium phosphate. We're looking to other suppliers, and there's been a lot in the news lately about some of these pharmaceutical manufacturers, pharmacy compounders, or what have you. There's lots of legislation ongoing right now looking at this. NECC, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the meningitis and the contamination of products, but as a healthcare society, we want to be able to provide you with drugs. And so if we need to get them from one of these other manufacturers, sometimes we need to do that to take care of our patients. One of the things that we do at Shands is we look at the quality aspects, and we inspect their quality reports. We have them send us pyrogen and endotoxin testing for each of the batches that they provide to us. So we really scrutinize these products, although they're not without fault. As a matter of fact, there was just a pharmacy last week that was cited by the FDA for some contaminated product. So it's an ongoing issue.
Do we have a question? Yeah.
And so that's a great question, Dr. Rathor, because if you're familiar with an editorial that was in New England Journal a couple years ago, they actually called that out. They said that the generic pharmaceutical manufacturers in Europe are not seeing any of these problems. The economics of making drugs in Europe is very different than the economics of making drugs in the States. And so in Europe, they're not seeing that. What we're finding is they're providing us with product. For example, propofol. They're giving us propofol. They're giving us phenylephrine. And so it's an economic piece.
And I will say, too, though, the regulatory aspects of the European manufacturers are much different. In fact, the FDA basically cited 3 manufacturers in London that were up to British standards, but that were not up to American FDA standards. So there is kind of a double-edged sword when we're dealing with this. We really have to look at quality, but you're correct, that there really has not been the type of shortages seen. There have been shortages. Most of the shortages have been for medications we produce on this side of the ocean, not on that side of the ocean. So it is, I mean, a lot of this is suspect. We are definitely not a global market when it comes to pharmaceuticals. Other questions? So, yes. You've got a microphone coming. Whoever gets there first.
Thank you. American healthcare has done a lot to diversify their revenue and their investments. Why don't we control this problem by making our own medications? We have several thousand hospitals in the country that have the financial resources to take over a generic company and control it, our own destiny on this moving forward. That might shake the drug industry up a little bit.
I'll make a couple of comments on that because it's a very good point, and actually one that was brought up almost a decade ago with the advent of biologicals. Most, as you may know, most of the biologicals, the Remicades in this country, were started and initially made at academic centers. And in fact, the first production runs were at most academic centers, then taken over by the pharmaceutical industries as an industrial complex. That is interesting. The first part of drug development, though, probably could not be handled in an academic center. There is no way they can, even taking the basic groundbreaking research, which they do, take that to a marketable project. It's almost ridiculous. They do not have the infrastructure. But on the other hand, as for production, absolutely, and it's been suggested even a decade ago that probably the more expensive biologicals should be actually manufactured by academic centers with the profits shared amongst the entire healthcare system. Now, as you know, the pharmaceutical industry has a huge legislative lobby. That got shot down relatively quickly, but it may be time to start bringing that up again, but an excellent point, Dr. Pauls.
Just to add to that, and by way of disclosure, I'm on the quality committee of the board of Premier, and we're a Premier customer, but it's not an advertisement. I can tell you that the acquisition and manufacturing of generic drugs is specifically on Premier's agenda. So that's a group of 900 hospitals approximately, plus or minus. It doesn't deal with the raw discovery and development, but a lot of these issues are really generic because when they're patent anyway, there's no shortage to begin with.
Exactly right. Other questions? Well, with that, I'm going to bring up the presenters. I don't know which order you're going to go in, and we'll start, and possibly some solutions from this from Mission Health. So, Rick?